Right, today's the 7th of May 2019. Not been a bad day, not been a particularly brilliant day, but it's not been bad. I've done things that needed doing, and I've eaten and I've drunk tea, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow. Now, if today is the 7th, that means tomorrow is presumably the 8th, Wednesday the 8th of May 2019, tomorrow. And this is a little bit of a trailer. I intend taking my camera with me somewhere tomorrow. However, I've just checked the weather forecast. That could cause a little difficulty because tomorrow is the day that Europe will remember the end of the Second World War in Europe, the end of the fighting in Europe. 8th of May 1945, the guns stopped firing. For this part of France, that's a very, very important celebration. I don't know how many of you remember the history of the Second World War. I think we've all got our own particular pieces of it. You know, we remember that John Wayne won it, all on his own. He was an admiral of the fleet in the Pacific. He was a general of parachutists in... This part of France had quite an unpleasant war. Not as unpleasant as some parts of the world, but nonetheless quite unpleasant. I think many of you will know that the war started for the Poles on the 1st of September 1939. It started for the French and the British and the Canadians, Australians and the rest of Europe, the rest of the British Empire and the French colonies on the 3rd of September 1939. At that point there was war going on in Poland, and a lot of what happened in this part of France was, some people would talk about the phony war. Nothing much. You know, armies being mobilised, factories getting into production, building the sort of stuff that you need. In May 1940, German forces attacked through Holland and Belgium, and the fighting got fairly interesting. I use the word interesting a lot. I use it to mean unpleasant, I use it to mean downright awful. And by the end of May, by the middle of June 1940, things for the British and the French and their allies were pretty dire. And the French signed an armistice with the Germans, which divided France into an area that was occupied by German forces and an area that wasn't, which was known as the Zone Libre. Azay-le-Ferron was in the Zone Libre. It wasn't occupied in 1940, which meant that there was a lot of refugees from other parts of Europe, other parts of France, that came here to escape the occupation. Well, that was all, I can't say well and good. It was pretty awful, but it wasn't war as such. They weren't occupied. Now, France had quite a serious division going on at this time. There were the Free French forces, we think of General de Gaulle, and there were the Vichy French, who were trying to protect as much of France as they could. Well, that was where they were until the Allied invasion of Italy, the Allied landings on the south of France, when the Germans said, right, enough, and they occupied the whole of the countryside. From this part of France, there were roundups of people that the National Socialists didn't like. We think predominantly of Jewish people, but it wasn't just Jewish people, there were others as well. Communists, various others that were rounded up and were shipped off to Poland and to places like Auschwitz, Belsen, those sorts of places. From this part of France, if you were rounded up, you probably started your journey by being taken to a camp at Duadik. That's where I went on Monday. I didn't go to the camp, I went to the town. But they rounded people up, they took them there to a camp from where they were shipped off towards Poland, many of them never to return. Well, things progressed. The Allied armies, including the French, fought their way into France. 1944, 6th of June 1944, everyone remembers that date. The Normandy landings. Very significant date in the history of the American, Canadian, British, French efforts to liberate Western Europe. Must never forget that something like 3 times as many Russian soldiers were already fighting on the other side, and other side of Europe, fighting on our side, on the Allied side. By August 1944, this part of France had been liberated from occupation. The fighting, as we know, rumbled on until the 8th of May 1945. After that, well, there was all sorts of strife and troubles. There were millions of displaced persons all across Europe. There were people who couldn't go home to their towns because they'd been flattened, or because they were now in the Soviet occupation zones, or it was peace, but it wasn't peaceful. Anyway, this town, along with many other towns in France, will celebrate the end of the actual fighting in Europe on the 8th of May. And what I'm hoping to see tomorrow is there will be a mass in the church, after which there will be a couple of parades. I suspect we're all going to get wet, because the weather forecast says it's going to rain all day. I know that people will go to it because people here remember it. One of my neighbours, her father was in prisoner of war camp for 5 years. Several of the neighbours here are related to people mentioned on the war memorial. Several of them are sufficiently old that they remember various things that happened here. The French resistance, the Maquis, were very active in this part of France. They did a grand job here. They delayed the movement of German forces from the south of France to Normandy, delayed them by a lot. There are Americans, Canadians, British people who survived that terrible fighting because German reinforcements were held up by the French Maquis of this town and this area. So it will be an emotional day. The Mackie had people captured, executed, and not just the Mackie, but there were reprisals here in this area. So there will be a lot of emotion. I hope to take you all with me tomorrow. There will be parts of the ceremony that I will have to take part in, but the rest, I hope, weather permitting, we'll get on film for you. In the meantime, I've got this out because there's something I need to practice. I do need to practice. I've got a feeling we'll be singing that tomorrow.